Even today in our modern era, there's still hundreds of uncontacted tribes scattered across the globe. These tribes live in some of the world's most remote places, and the uncontacted tribe known as the Pintupi Nine certainly isn't an exception. The Pintupi Nine were a group of fittingly 9 people living a nomadic lifestyle in the land around the Lake Mackay region. The Pintupi Nine would set out makeshift camps near Australian waterholes. These waterholes were often 25 miles apart from each other or even more, which led to extremely long and dangerous treks through the Australian outback. Oftentimes, there was no water for these treks, so the Pintupi people would drink the blood of lizards so that they didn't become too dehydrated. The 9 Pintupi people consisted of 2 sisters and their 7 teenage children, 4 brothers and 3 sisters. There was one father for these children who had passed away early into their lives. The main reason the Pintupi people were so remote was because in 1950, the British military began conducting missile tests over the western desert region of Australia and decided to round up the desert nomad tribes to make sure nobody was accidentally hit during these missile launches. All of the Pintupi people were taken away and moved to a nearby settlement, except for this one family of 9 that avoided any interaction with the British. The Pintupi family would remember seeing the occasional plane flying from above and believed it to be the devil. They thought these planes were supernatural beings and would hide in trees when they flew above. Finally, in the late 1970s, the Pintupi people that were relocated in the 1950s were able to move back to their land that they once called home. These people had always wondered what happened to the Pintupi family that got left behind. The leader of the Pintupi Nine was a man named Pingra. He was out one day hunting and he had just speared a kangaroo. He then started being able to smell the scent of other humans, predicting that they were just a couple kilometers away, and he even saw smoke in the distance. He began moving closer to the smoke and soon saw people camping down below. This was his first sight of humans other than the Pintupi Nine. Pingra got very close to these campers and then accidentally coughed to where the campers now immediately noticed Pingra. The campers were extremely afraid of Pingra and started running back and forth, trying to gather their possessions. The campers then fired a shotgun in the air and quickly drove off despite having a flat tire. Pingra could hear the car driving far into the distance. This was his first time seeing people wearing clothes, running water, and a motor car. The 2 campers that fled the area were named Pinta and Matthew. These 2 men raced back to the nearby settlement, which was the Kirakura community, and explained to everyone what they had just saw. The community figured that this naked man must have been a member of the long-lost Pintupi tribe. The community organized a search party to go out and look for the tribe the next day. After a few days of searching, 2 of the young girls in the Pintupi Nine were the first to be found, Yokulchi and her sister Yalti. The mother was also there, but managed to not be seen hiding in the tall grass. The men put the 2 young girls in their car, gave them clothes to wear, and began driving off. The girls were extremely frightened as they had not only never been in a car before, but they had also just been kidnapped by people that they didn't even know existed. Pingra, the leader of the Pintupi Nine, had heard what happened and tracked down the car to get his 2 sisters back. Pingra confronted the car once it had stopped driving and was armed with a spear. The men driving the car quickly shouted that they were also members of the Pintupi tribe and explained that they were long-lost family. Pingra could see that the men weren't harming his sisters and the tension soon died. Luckily, the Pintupi Nine were confronted not only by men of the same tribe, but also by other humans that could speak their same language. This fortunate scenario was not the same case when the Pintupi people were originally moved out of the Australian desert back in the 1950s. When the Pintupi Nine were brought back into the Kirakura community and met their long-lost family, they decided to join this civilized life and adjust to a completely new society. Adjusting to civilian life wasn't easy for all 9, however. One of the brothers named Pairti returned to the Australian outback by himself, and the Pintupi Nine now didn't really mention this brother in conversations. Civilized life has been decent for the Pintupi Nine, but has also exposed them to some of the nastier parts of the world, such as alcoholism and obesity. Although the Pintupi Nine were able to peacefully assimilate into Australian culture, a group that hasn't been so peaceful with its neighbors are the Mashco Piro living in Peru. Members of the Mashco Piro tribe tribe often appear on the banks of the Alto Madre de Dios River and live in the Manu National Park. The Mashco tribe were known to be fairly passive up until 2001. After this year, the Mashco people were becoming increasingly hostile, with anyone traveling down the Alto Madre de Dios River, where they would shoot arrows out into the water and aim at environmentalists exploring the land. This act of hostility likely shows that they feel their land is being overtaken, and they're starting to feel the threat that they could be losing their home. In recent years, the Mashco people have become more and more hostile, to where they are now the ones initiating the contact with civilized towns. Two villages, Diamante and Chaipatari, near the Manu National Park had to be evacuated when the Mashco people began approaching, loaded with their bows and arrows. The Mashco people have stolen tools from these towns and even shot arrows at villagers, where people have unfortunately been struck. This increased tension has forced the Peruvian government to get involved, and now has an outpost on the Alto Madre de Dios River to patrol the Mashco people's movement. Mashco means wild ones or savages, which the Peruvian people believe accurately describes their behavior. The Mashco people obviously don't like this name and prefer to be known as the Nomole people. There was one man known as Chaco Flores who lived in the nearby town of Diamante. Flores was in regular communication with the Mashco people and would give the Mashco people whatever they asked for. Flores was part of a similar ethnicity and knew most of the language of the Mashco people. The resources Flores would give the Mashco people typically included wooden tools and many bananas. Flores eventually decided that he didn't want to help the Mashco people any longer, and the Mashcos weren't thrilled with the sudden change of attitude. In late 2011, the Mashco people targeted him while he was at his home. The first two times, their arrows missed, and Flores was able to evade the attack. Then the third time the Mashcos came back, they successfully hit Flores in the heart, and he unfortunately succumbed to this arrow strike. It's believed that when the Mashcos ask for something, and you don't give them exactly what they want, then they will threaten to shoot you. The people living in Diamante did not want to fight back for revenge, as they feel the Mashco people are just long-lost family members that were separated long ago. After all, they share mostly the same language and have a very similar physical appearance. But in Chaipatari, they don't speak the same language as the Mashco, feel no brotherly ties, and want absolutely nothing to do with them. The town of Chaipatari has had to close down its ecotourism industry because the forests around the town are no longer safe with the increasing hostility from the Mashco tribe. Ecotourism was the main income for much of the town, so many of the residents here were soon without a job. The Peruvian government has had to warn the Mashco people to stay away from Chaipatari, but there's no guarantee that the Mashco tribe will honor this truce. As for now, the people in Chaipatari are on high alert. Not very far from the Manu National Forest is the Brazilian Amazon rainforest. In this rainforest, that spans just about the entire size of the continental United States, there's believed to be over 100 uncontacted tribes, the most out of anywhere in the world. While little is known about these groups, one thing that is known is that they definitely want to remain uncontacted. These tribes will often shoot arrows at planes that fly overhead and hide deep into the forests when they believe outsiders are approaching. One of these groups is known as the Awa people. During the 19th century, the Awa people came under increasing attack from the European colonists that were clearing forests in this land. Because of this, the Awa people adopted a nomadic lifestyle where they could set up a camp in a few hours and then abandon it and move to their next home a couple days later. The Awa people use very long bows and arrows, where their arrows can measure over 4 meters or 13 feet in length. It's also believed that they enjoy eating tortoises, considering shells of them have been discovered at abandoned camps of the Awa people. In the early 2000s, illegal logging had dramatically reduced the number of living Awa people, where there's roughly only 300 left. Only 60 of these remaining 300 are still living their traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyle. In 2011, illegal loggers burned an 8-year-old Awa girl alive when she wandered outside of her village. Apparently, this extreme act was meant as a message to the Awa people, signaling signaling that they needed to give up their home and hand it over to the logging industry. From the years of 2003 to 2010, about 450 indigenous people living in the Amazon rainforest were killed by loggers. Other uncontacted groups have been teetering on the edge of extinction, where there's only a handful within these tribes left compared to what there once was. These last uncontacted tribes mainly live in the regions of Rondonia, Mato Grosso, and the Maranhão states. These groups are also extremely vulnerable to common illnesses such as the flu or even a common cold, which can be transmitted by outsiders living in the modern civilizations. In 2011, the Brazilian government conducted a satellite sweep to get a better understanding as to how many uncontacted people were out in their country, and to their great surprise, they detected people living in areas that were widely considered to be uninhabitable. These tribes still remain a great mystery and would be extremely difficult to even get to. Another uncontacted tribe that is potentially even harder to reach is the Yaifo people living in the East Sepik region of Papua New Guinea. This tribe has only had one known communication with an outsider, which took place back in 1988. An explorer named Benedict Allen was traveling through the remote regions of Papua New Guinea looking for uncontacted tribes when he stumbled upon the Yaifo people. In his encounter, the Yaifo people supposedly showed a terrifying deal of strength and an energetic dance in which they displayed their bows and arrows. He also believed them to be cannibals during this brief interaction. Benedict was scared off once the Yaifo people stopped dancing and started approaching Benedict in a hostile manner. Benedict Allen tried returning to this tribe almost 30 years later in November of 2017, but was unsuccessful in finding them. There are believed to be over 40 different uncontacted tribes living in the rainforests of West Papua New Guinea and land where it's illegal for outsiders to enter. The Papua New Guinea government enacted this law in order to protect the second highest concentration of uncontacted tribes behind the Brazilian rainforest. While Papua New Guinea is a country with not many people, even highly populated countries like the United States had uncontacted people living in its land hundreds of years after the formation of the country. By the early 1900s, European Americans had completely overwhelmed the North American continent. All indigenous people in this land had now either assimilated into American culture or had at least been in contact with the new Americans. That was, except for one man whose name was Ishi. Ishi is known to be the last discovered Native American, where he was found lost and starving near an Oroville, California slaughterhouse in 1911. Ishi spoke no English and was not familiar at all with American ways or culture. The police took this man into custody for his own protection and so that he could get help from a hospital. There was an anthropologist named Thomas Waterman living in California at the time that studied the language and the dialects of the Native Americans living in Northern California. Waterman tried communicating a few words to Ishi from the language of the Yana Indians, to which some words made sense. Waterman eventually took Ishi to live in Berkeley, California, to where Ishi and Waterman were able to increasingly have better and better communication. Waterman was eventually able to learn that Ishi was part of the Yahi people, which was an isolated branch of the Northern California Yana tribe. Ishi was around 50 years old and was the very last of his people. Ishi had been wandering the mountains of Northern California for several years with other members of the Yahi people. Over the course of these years, different accidents and diseases had killed off many of the Yahi people. Ishi had one final male companion who was killed by a white man. Ishi then wandered alone until he reached the outskirts of Oroville and was found by hikers. Ishi ended up living at the Berkeley Museum for 5 years, where he taught others his advanced skills in archery, woodcraft, and other survival skills. Ishi was becoming more and more accustomed to the modern world, but unfortunately passed from tuberculosis at the age of 56. While many of these uncontacted tribes are widely unknown by the public, one of the most well-known uncontacted tribes is the people of North Sentinel Island. North Sentinel Island is part of the Andaman Island chain in India's Bay of Bengal. There are likely 80 to 150 mostly uncontacted people living on North Sentinel Island. In fact, it's actually illegal to go within 3 miles of this island, as the few people who have stumbled upon this island haven't been met with a very friendly greeting. The nearest civilization to North Sentinel Island is just 50 miles away in the city of Port Blair. The first encounter with the Sentinelese came in 1867 when an English ship crashed on the island. The British first believed that this looked like a tropical paradise, but without any warning, arrows started flying in their direction. The British didn't attempt to fight back, but rather hid inside their ship and called for help from other nearby militaries. The British were eventually rescued a few days later, but the following people to visit the island didn't come out as lucky. In 2006, two men were on a fishing trip out in the Bay of Bengal. One night, the men started drinking too much that they ended up falling asleep. While in their sleep, their anchor ended up breaking, and the boat ended up drifting with the tide. The following morning, fellow fishermen tried shouting at the men and warning them that they were approaching illegal waters. The men never responded and ended up drifting onto North Sentinel Island. These two men were never seen again. And then even more recently in November of 2018, an American evangelist named John Chow wanted to sneak onto the island to tell the Sentinelese about the good news of Jesus Christ. John paid local Indian fishermen $335 to bring him out onto a boat and near the island. John also brought with him a canoe so that he could leave the fishermen and then paddle to North Sentinel Island alone. On John's first attempt to visit the Sentinelese, John stripped down into his underwear in an effort to make himself appear more relatable to the North Sentinel people. He soon saw a hut and some dugout canoes. As he started paddling closer to the beach, several Sentinelese, with faces painted bright yellow, came out of the forest, rushing towards him and screaming a language of high-pitched sounds. John, startled by this, yelled, "My name is John, I love you, and Jesus loves you." When the islanders began cocking their bows and arrows, John panicked and threw some fish he brought with him as a gift in their direction and quickly began paddling away from the island to avoid the arrows. Later that day, John wanted to make another attempt to the island, this time bringing with him more gifts. John approached the same hut that he saw earlier, making sure he stayed out of arrows' range. As he started making it closer to the island, a half-dozen Sentinelese noticed him and ran out of the woods shouting at him in the same high-pitched tone. Now John was on foot on the beach and walked closer to hear what they were saying. John began singing worship songs and preached from the book of Genesis. The Sentinelese at first seemed confused and then started laughing when they could hear John singing. Without any warning, a boy shot an arrow at John, which went right through his waterproof Bible. John pulled the arrow out, gave it back to the boy, and then started swimming back to the fishing boat over a mile away, considering the Sentinelese had taken his canoe. On the morning of November 16th, 2018, John asked the fisherman to drop him off alone so that the Sentinelese may feel more comfortable by his presence and so that hopefully the fisherman wouldn't have to potentially see John's death. John went out to meet the Sentinelese once again on this morning and was unfortunately never seen again. While it's obvious that these uncontacted tribes have a completely different view of the world than most people living in civilized communities, what often isn't always noticed is that depending on where you live in the world, maps will often look different. Growing up in the United States or Europe, for example, the map in your history textbook will probably look much different than people growing up in North Korea. To find out exactly what maps look like in other parts of the world, check out this video right here.